Do you have the gospel right? Because if you don't, if you have a different gospel, then Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, you really have no gospel at all. Last Sunday we started a sermon series on the book of Galatians, and we'll take the next few weeks to talk about Paul's defense of the gospel, because anything else really isn't any gospel at all. At least not to be considered or to be used by us as Christians. Think of it like the difference between something that is classic and something that is common. On yesterday we went to the Memorial Day parade, and certain individuals will be riding in cars. And as we're sitting there, to my kids, they just look like cars. They don't know the difference. But I could explain to them, oh, that's a classic car. That's not just your everyday average car. And then I could point out the ones that were everyday average cars, just because it was what everybody else was driving. But the classic ones, the ones that once they rolled off the line, they were good, and they will stand the test of time. That's something different. That's something special. So it is with God's Word. The teaching of the gospel that comes right from God's Word is not something that we mess around with. You don't change it around. Once it rolls off the line, once it came from God through the inspiration of God to his writers, the apostles and prophets, it was good as it was. You don't change it. Another good comparison would maybe be like Grandma's cookie recipe. How would Grandma feel if you took what she wrote down and started changing it? That would be a perversion. And really that's what Paul considers those who change the gospel, a perversion. Because if it's anything but about Christ, then it's not what God intended it to be for you. If it's anything that has to do with you, your decision, your work, your goodness, your anything, then that is not the gospel. That is not the gospel that the Apostle Paul preached, that God gave him to preach, because God is the creator of the gospel, and commissioned Paul to go and speak that gospel. And it's really no gospel at all. If it's anything different, then it's not what we want to be doing as Christians, to be studying, to be learning. And don't be confused, because some will say that, well, we're different churches, you're Lutheran, I'm this, we're that. No, there are differences. And there are those out there that do not have the gospel because they have a different gospel, that it includes something about you, something that you have to add to it, something that makes you think, well, there was this Jesus thing, and now there's something more. That's really no gospel at all. And if it's not the gospel, then it's clearly the law. And nobody can be saved by the law. The only thing that the law does is point to you and say, here, see, this is where you messed up. It's the only thing the law can do. It can't save you. But Jesus does. Jesus did. Jesus fulfilled the law. He did that for you. He did it in your place. He took on every responsibility that the law required and was perfect. And he did that for you. The law was fulfilled and it was completed so that you don't have to worry about the law for salvation. Christ did that. That's the gospel. And that's what we hear and preach and have as our central focus every time we gather for worship. Anytime we gather around a devotion like this, as it centers on God's Word, it centers on Christ for salvation. Now certainly we go out and we'll still use what is classic, right? That classic car, you're not just going to keep it in the garage. That classic chocolate chip cookie recipe, you're going to pull it out and you're going to use it. So it is with God's Word. So that we can keep it as it is, we continue to use it. To know what it says is a lifelong work for us as students of the Word, to get into God's Word, to know what it says, so that we can test whatever is out there and ask the question, what does this have to do with the gospel? What does this do to the gospel? If it diminishes the gospel, if it confuses, if it perverts the gospel, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, then it's really no gospel at all, and not a gospel for you. So continue to focus on what God says in His Word, and ask that question about church programs and traditions, and even about your preachers. What does this do to the gospel? Thanks for listening. This has been Pastor Nate Fager.